February 1942, the 99th day of their personal apocalypse. Leningrad, minus 32 degrees Celsius, minus 25.6 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and it seemed just as cold inside. In a room where the air was so frigid you could cut it with a knife, 4 figures, barely visible in the dim light of a soot lamp, were frozen like ancient statues carved from despair. This was the Orlov family, though the word family had long since become an empty sound, a ghost from another pre-war life. Now they were simply 4 organisms, united by a single goal: to survive until the next dawn. At the center of this icy world, at a table coated in frost, sat Dmitry Petrovich Orlov, a former pharmacist, now the high priest and executioner of their small cult. His face, once intellectual and soft, had become a mask of parchment stretched over a skull. His eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, burned with the feverish, almost insane fire of precision. Before him on the table, on a clean cloth wiped to a shine, stood their god and their devil, old pharmacist's scales of tarnished brass. Beside them lay the object of their worship and hatred, a tiny dark crumb of siege bread. 125 grams for the 4 of them, 31 grams and 250 milligrams for each soul. No more, no less. Dmitry Petrovich moved with a mesmerizing, ritualistic slowness. His fingers, which looked more like dry twigs, gripped the blade of his father's old razor, the only tool capable of ensuring the necessary precision. He didn't breathe. It seemed everything in the room had stopped breathing. His wife, Anna Arkadyevna, sat opposite him. She wasn't looking at her husband. Her gaze was fixed on his hands, and in her eyes swirled such a mixture of hatred, pleading, and animal hunger that it could have lit another lamp. She hated those scales. She hated this precision. She hated him for turning their lives into a mathematical formula where there was no room left for love or pity. Beside her, huddled into a ball under a pile of rags, sat the children. Katya, who was 12 but looked 8, stared at her father with reverent horror. He was her savior, the one whose iron will kept their world from complete collapse. And he was also the monster who weighed her life every day on those terrifying impassive scales. The younger one, 7-year-old Alyosha, barely moved anymore. He just sat, staring at a single point, moaning softly, almost inaudibly. His body was being consumed by dystrophy, and Anna knew that her husband's justice was killing her son more slowly, but just as surely, as any German bomb. A crumb of bread fell onto the scale pan. The needle quivered, then settled, showing a perfect balance. Dmitry Petrovich exhaled a satisfied cloud of vapor. The first portion was ready. He looked at his family, but he did not see them. He saw only 4 units requiring calories to sustain their vital functions. His intellect, his salvation, and his curse had long ago walled him off from emotion. He was not a husband or a father. He was a system that had to function without failure. But to understand how the former pharmacist, loving husband and caring father had turned into an impassive accountant of grams and milligrams, how his family had become a pack locked in a cage of ice, we must go back 100 days to that last autumn day when they still believed in the future, and the word hunger was just an abstract concept from books. August of 1941 still breathed warmth, but a subtle, cloying anxiety already hung in the Leningrad air. The city seemed to hold its breath, listening to the distant but relentlessly approaching thunder of war. In the Orlovs' apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, however, a fragile world of educated domesticity still reigned. Dmitry Petrovich, a tall, slightly stooped man of 45 with kind, near-sighted eyes behind his glasses, sat at his favorite oak table and read The Odyssey aloud. His voice, soft and measured, was the anchor holding their family ship steady in the raging sea of news and rumors. Anna Arkadyevna, his wife, a woman with lively, laughing eyes and a shock of unruly dark hair, was mending Katya's school uniform, the needle in her quick hands flashing like a silver fish. Katya, a serious and thoughtful girl, was drawing something bright and sunny in her album, a world without air raids and blacked-out windows. And little Alyosha, a fidget and a whirlwind, was busy on the carpet with his wooden soldiers, staging impromptu battles in which their side always won. Dmitri Petrovich worked in a pharmacy, but his true passion was chemistry, the science of transformations, of the strict order hidden within the chaos of elements. He believed in logic, in formulas, in the idea that every problem had a rational solution. To him, war was a monstrous, irrational glitch in the system of the universe, but he was convinced that it too could be survived by maintaining discipline and clarity of mind. "It won't be for long, Anechka," he would tell his wife in the evenings when the radio brought another batch of alarming reports. "Our army is strong. It will all be over soon. The main thing is not to give in to panic. Panic is the worst enemy." And Anna believed him because she wanted to believe, because his calmness was infectious. One such evening, while sorting through old things in the attic, he came across a small wooden box. Blowing off decades of dust, he opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, rested a set of antique pharmacist scales, inherited from his grandfather, also a pharmacist. The brass was tarnished, but the mechanism was in perfect condition. With them was a full set of weights, from heavy gram pieces to tiny, almost weightless milligram plates in a separate case. He brought them into the room, and the children immediately gathered around him. "Papa, what is that?" Katya asked. "This, my daughter, is an instrument of precision," Dmitri Petrovich answered with pride. "These scales do not lie. They show the true weight of things, without deceit or assumptions." He showed them how the delicate mechanism worked, how the slightest breath makes the balance beam tremble. Alyosha breathed excitedly on a pan, and the needle obediently swung. It was a game, a fun artifact from the past. None of them could have imagined then that this toy, this symbol of a bygone era, would soon become the center of their universe, their only hope, and their most terrible curse. They were still laughing. They were still drinking hot tea with sugar and believing that the worst would pass them by. They did not know that on the 8th of September the ring would close, that the steel hoop of the blockade would tighten around their city, cutting it off from the rest of the world. That evening, when the radio announced the beginning of the siege, Dmitri Petrovich, as usual, tried to calm his family. He said the right words about courage, about temporary difficulties, about a swift victory. But when the children were asleep, he stood for a long time by the window, staring into the dark, hostile sky. And for the first time, a cold, sticky fear stirred in his soul. He looked at his sleeping children, at his wife, and understood that he was now responsible for them not only to society, but to the face of a merciless, irrational force. He did not yet know what choice he would have to make, but he already felt that his faith in logic and order was about to face the most terrible test of his life. The 8th of September, 1941, was the day the world collapsed. Not all at once, not with a deafening crash, but gradually, as if the rotten supports of an old house were giving way one by one under an inexorable weight. First, the supplies in the stores disappeared. The lines, recently just a part of the city landscape, turned into hours-long silent vigils of desperate people. Then came the ration cards. The allowances seemed meager, but still tolerable. People, optimists by nature, believed it was a temporary measure. "We'll hold on for a month, 2, and then our boys will break the ring," they said on the streets. But the ring was not broken. Instead, the bombing began. The first air raid caught the Orlovs by surprise. The deafening wailing sound of the siren burst into their cozy apartment, shattering the glass in the window frames and in their souls. They fled to the bomb shelter, a damp, dark basement packed with frightened, whispering shadows. Alyosha cried, burying his face in Anna's coat, while Katya, pale but with clenched teeth, looked to her father, seeking confirmation in his face that everything would be all right. Dmitri Petrovich remained steadfast, offering words of encouragement to the neighbors, explaining to the children that it was just thunder, only very loud. But inside, everything was turning to ice. He could hear the earth shuddering from explosions somewhere very near. and he understood that his world, a world of books, formulas, and a measured life, was crumbling to dust. The most terrible blow was the fire at the Badayev warehouses. For several days, black, greasy smoke shrouded the sky over Leningrad, and this smoke smelled of grief. It smelled of burnt sugar, flour, butter, the products that were supposed to feed the city all winter. People said it was the end. That starvation was now inevitable. It was then that a certain expression appeared in people's eyes, one that Dmitri Petrovich would later see everywhere. The look of a cornered, starving animal. The bread ration began to shrink. 250 grams for workers, 125 for office workers, dependents, and children. This small, sticky, damp piece of dark mass, which was called bread only out of habit, became the city's main currency. It became the measure of life. For the first few weeks, they still tried to live as they used to. Anna worked miracles of ingenuity, making a thin soup from a handful of grain and a few potato peels. They ate slowly, stretching out every spoonful. But the feeling of fullness never came. Hunger was a dull, aching beast that had taken up residence in their stomachs and grew angrier with each passing day. One evening, the first breakdown occurred. Alyosha, unable to bear it, snatched a piece of bread from the table that had been set aside for the next day and frantically shoved it into his mouth. Anna gasped, and Katya looked at her brother with a mixture of reproach and envy. Dmitri Petrovich said nothing. He simply walked over, silently took the remaining part from his son, and put it back in its place. He couldn't sleep for a long time that night. He listened to the wind howling outside the window, to the distant muffled boom of an anti-aircraft gun, and he thought about how chaos was already seeping into his home, how animal instincts were beginning to overpower reason and upbringing. The panic he so despised was knocking at his door. He realized that if he did not do something, their family would cease to exist long before they starved to death. They would devour each other morally, destroy one another with hatred and suspicion. And then he made a decision. A terrible, inhuman decision, but, as it seemed to him, the only correct one. In the morning, he woke the family. His face was stern and resolute. He silently went to the attic and retrieved that same wooden box. He placed it in the center of the table and opened it. The brass scales gleamed dully in the morning light. He looked at his wife and children. "Starting today, we will have a new order." His voice was as hard as steel. "The food will be divided equally, down to the last milligram. No more tomorrow or yesterday. Only what we have today. And I will be the one to divide it. Fairly." Anna looked at him, and horror began to dawn in her eyes. She saw not her husband, but a cold, alien man. Katya and Alyosha were silent, not fully understanding what was happening. They only sensed that the game was over. In that moment, he looked at his terrified, silent loved ones, then at the elegant, impassive balance beam of the scales. And in that moment, he understood. If they wanted to survive, he had to become not just their father and husband, but their jailer and their god. The first days of the new order passed in a tense, oppressive silence. The Orlovs' apartment transformed into something like a monastery, where every sound, every gesture was subject to a strict ritual. The pharmacist's scales became the center of this new world. Twice a day, morning and evening, Dmitri Petrovich performed the sacred rite. He would take the daily ration from its precious pouch, 400 grams of bread for the four of them, if they were lucky, and sometimes only 300, and begin the division. He worked with the same concentration with which he used to prepare complex medicines in his pharmacy. First, he would cut 4 roughly equal pieces. Then, each one was placed on the brass pan. He would pick up crumbs with a razor blade, transferring them from one pan to the other until the needle of the scales came to a perfectly still rest. His family watched this process, holding their breath. Their gazes were riveted to his hands, to the tiny weights, to every movement of the needle. In those minutes there was neither love nor hatred in the room, only tense anticipation and all-consuming hunger. Alyosha was the first to break. His young body could not comprehend this mathematical justice. He would cry, begging for more. Anna tried to soothe him, hugging him, rocking him, but her embraces were cold, and her voice held powerless, hysterical notes. Dmitri Petrovich remained adamant. "We are all hungry," he would say, not looking at his son. "If I give him more, someone else gets less. The law is the same for everyone. It's the only way to survive." Gradually, they began to adjust. The hunger never left. It became their constant companion, but the system introduced by their father brought a semblance of stability to their existence. They knew they would get their share, not a milligram less. This relieved them of the need to fight, to scheme, to hate each other over an extra crumb. But this same system was killing everything human in them. Conversations ceased. What was there to talk about when all thoughts were only of food? They would sit for hours, wrapped in rags, silent, listening to the rumbling in their own stomachs and the distant boom of the cannonade. The apartment, once full of laughter and warmth, had become an icy cave. A thick layer of ice covered the windows, and frost coated the walls. The only source of heat was a small makeshift stove, a burzhuika, which Dmitri Petrovich had fashioned from an old bucket. They fed it with anything that would burn: furniture, books, the parquet floor. One day, Katya saw her father, without hesitation, break up a chair he had made for her when she was little. She said nothing, but that night she cried quietly under her blanket for a long time. Their world had shrunk to the size of a single room. Trips outside for water from the ice hole on the Neva or for bread became dangerous excursions into a hostile world. Bodies lay in the streets, uncollected. People who looked like shadows staggered along, swaying from the wind and weakness, and no one looked at each other. The city was dying, and they were dying with it. Dmitri Petrovich, as a man of science, tried to fight hunger rationally. He had read in an old medical handbook that carpenter's glue, boiled down from animal bones, contained a certain amount of protein. He found a can of old glue, boiled it for a long time on the burzhuika, skimming off the dirty foam. The resulting jelly had a disgusting smell and taste, but they ate it. They scraped wallpaper paste from the walls and boiled it, adding pine needles for scent. They found an old leather belt, cut it into pieces, and boiled it for hours until it turned into something resembling soft rubber. This wasn't food. It was fuel, which they shoveled into the furnaces of their fading bodies. But one day, a terrible blow awaited them. The bread ration was cut again. Now, for the 4 of them, there were only 125 grams a day, 31¼ grams per person. This was no longer a ration. It was a mockery. Dmitri Petrovich performed the weighing ritual with the same cold precision. He handed each of them their share, a tiny, almost weightless cube. Anna took her bread, looked at her husband, and there was no longer fear in her eyes, only a cold, ringing hatred. She understood that his system, his justice, had become a death sentence, and the first to be condemned was their son. With each passing day, Dmitri Petrovich's system, designed to save them from chaos, more and more resembled a perfectly calibrated instrument of torture. It did not let them die quickly. It prolonged the agony, turning each day into an exact copy of the one before. The weighing ritual became not just a distribution of food, but an act of asserting power. The power of order over nature, the power of a father over his family. It had been their first victory over despair. After they started boiling the carpenter's glue, Dmitri Petrovich felt a pang of professional pride. He hadn't just found a food substitute. He had applied knowledge. He explained the chemical composition of the glue to his numb family, talking about the hydrolysis of collagen, about amino acids. His voice was steady and confident, like a lecturer's. He was trying to prove to them, and above all to himself, that they were not just animals eating carrion, but rational beings, fighting the elements with intellect. This was their unexpected weapon. Not a rifle, not a grenade, but knowledge, extracted from dusty books and a peaceful profession. Soon he made another discovery. He remembered that some pre-war shoe polishes contained bone fat. They had one such tin left. He spent a long time boiling the kerosene out of the black paste until he had a tiny lump of dark, rancid fat. They used this substance to coat their lips to keep them from cracking in the frost. And sometimes, on the hardest days, he would add a microscopic drop to their watery soup. It gave the illusion of fullness, deceiving the brain. At first, Anna had refused the glue concoction with disgust, but hunger was stronger than revulsion. 2 days later, she was eating with the rest of them, silently, without looking at her plate, trying not to breathe. She became his first silent ally, not because she believed he was right, but because she had no other choice. Her capitulation strengthened his authority. Now his word was law, not subject to debate. The children also accepted the new rules. Katya, being older, even tried to help her father. She tended the fire in the burjuika, gathering splinters when they broke up another book or chair. She saw that her father's system, however cruel, was working. They were still alive, while next door their neighbors, the artist family, had faded one by one, unable to organize their lives. They had heard the cries first fall silent, and then an eternal quiet had set in. That silence was the most convincing argument for Dmitri Petrovich's methods. This small victory, this fragile equilibrium they had created, instilled in them a ghostly hope. They stopped thinking about rescue from the outside. They focused on surviving within their icy fortress. But their sanctuary was treacherous. It saved them from bombs and frost, but it also changed them. One night, as everyone slept, Dmitri Petrovich was awakened by a strange sound. He listened, a scratching noise. He lit the soot lamp and saw a terrible sight. Alyosha, his little son, was on his knees by the wall, chewing the wallpaper. Not the paste underneath, but the paper itself, covered in poisonous paint. The madness of hunger was now knocking at their door. He silently picked his son up, carried him to bed, and covered him with rags. He said nothing, but that night he understood that their first victory over hunger had been merely a temporary respite. The real enemy wasn't outside. It was within. It sat in their stomachs, it clouded their minds, it was turning them into creatures for whom nothing existed but the primal instinct to eat. Their icy empire, built on a foundation of mathematical precision and chemical surrogates, lasted for almost 2 months. Dmitri Petrovich had perfected his system. Every day was scheduled to the minute. Waking at dawn, which could only be guessed by a slight change in color in the frosty patterns on the glass. The morning weighing ritual. Then the long, endless hours of waiting. During this time, everyone had their own task. Dmitri Petrovich kept a diary. On the pages of an old accounting ledger, he described in calligraphic handwriting not his feelings, but their diet, the temperature in the room, the amount of fuel remaining. It was the report of a scientist conducting an inhuman experiment with his own family and himself as the subjects. Anna spent most of her time lying motionless, conserving her strength. She retreated into herself, into memories of a past life where there was hot soup, laughter, and the warmth of her beloved husband. These memories were her only refuge and her cruelest torture. Katya cared for Alyosha. She told him stories she made up on the spot. Tales of magical lands where tables groaned with food, where rivers of milk flowed with banks of honey cake. Alyosha would listen, and sometimes a spark of interest would flicker in his large, sunken eyes. In the evening, the second weighing ritual, followed by another long, cold night full of heavy dreams about food. This routine, this harsh, predictable rhythm gave them a psychological anchor. They were not abandoned to fate. They were part of a system, a mechanism. Dmitri Petrovich was firmly established as their leader, their demiurge. His word was irrefutable. He decided when to eat, when to sleep, which book to burn in the stove today. He had become for them the embodiment of order in a world plunged into chaos. But this dictatorship, while saving their bodies, was slowly killing their souls. They had ceased to be a family. They had become the crew of a submarine lying dormant on the seabed, where the commander demands unquestioning obedience for the sake of a common goal. They even began to look different. Hunger had erased the individual features from their faces, making them resemble one another, sharp-nosed with huge dark eyes and earthy-colored skin. They moved slowly, smoothly, conserving every movement, every word. Their small world was stable. It was horrific, but it was predictable, and perhaps they could have held on like this for much longer. But in any system, sooner or later, an element appears that begins to rot it from the inside. In their family, that element was a mother's love. Anna saw that Alyosha was fading. Her husband's fair portion was a death sentence for him. His small, weakened body needed more. Every day she watched her son turn into a living skeleton, watched the life drain from his eyes, and in her soul, scorched by hunger and despair, a hatred began to grow. A hatred for her husband, for his scales, for his murderous, inhuman logic. She began to watch. She noticed that Katya, though emaciated, was holding up better. She was older, her body was stronger. And then a terrible, monstrous thought was born in Anna's mind. A thought that could save one of her children, but only by sacrificing the other. In the silence of their icy apartment, a rebellion began to fester. Not a loud, open one, but the quiet, desperate rebellion of a mother prepared to do anything to save her child. The breaking point was reached one evening when the frost seemed to have penetrated their very bones. Alyosha had eaten almost nothing for several days. He just lay, turned to the wall, breathing softly. His portion of bread remained untouched. He was too weak to chew. After the evening weighing ritual, when Dmitri Petrovich had laid out the 4 microscopic pieces of bread with his usual methodicalness, Anna could not take it any more. She raised her head, and her eyes, burning in the gloom, locked onto her husband. "Dima," her voice was hoarse and alien, "he is dying." Dmitri Petrovich did not answer. He continued to look at the scales, as if he hadn't heard her. "Do you hear me?" Anna's voice rose. "Our son is dying. He needs more food." "We have no more food," he replied evenly, not taking his eyes off the needle. "Everyone has the same portion. That is what is fair." And then the dam broke. "To hell with your justice," she screamed. And this cry, full of pain and fury, made Katya flinch. "Can't you see your justice is killing him? He's weaker than Katya. Give him her portion, at least some of it. Katya can endure. She's older." It was the one thought that had hung in the air, but no one had dared to voice it. The proposition to sacrifice one child for the other. Dmitri Petrovich slowly raised his head and looked at his wife. There was no sympathy or anger in his gaze. Only a cold, icy bewilderment, like that of a scientist confronted with the irrational behavior of a test subject. "That is impossible," he cut her off. "If we start making exceptions, the whole system will collapse. Today we give Katya's portion to Alyosha. Tomorrow Katya will be weaker and will have to give your portion to her, and then mine to you. That is a path to nowhere. It is chaos. Only equal chances for everyone. That is the only law that is saving us." "It's not saving us. It's killing us," Anna sobbed. "You're not a father, you're a monster. You sit there with your scales like an idol, weighing the lives of our children. Don't you love him? Love is an unaffordable luxury." His voice was quiet, but each word struck like the lash of a whip. "Right now, there's only mathematics. 31 grams. Not 32 and not 30. Exactly 31. Any other number is death for all of us." He was absolutely convinced he was right. In his tormented brain, this logic was the only escape from madness. He believed that if he deviated even a millimeter from his principles, everything he had built, their entire fragile empire of survival, would crumble to dust, and they would sink into a primal struggle for crumbs, like the neighbors next door. Anna looked at him, and the tears dried on her cheeks. She realized it was useless to argue. She was looking at a monster born of hunger and fear, a man who had hidden from the horror of reality behind the armor of soulless numbers. She stood up, went to Alyosha, and took his untouched piece of bread in her own. She soaked them in a mug of warm water and began to feed her son with a spoon, as if he were an infant. Dmitri Petrovich and Katya silently ate their portions. That evening, the Orlov family ceased to exist. All that remained were 4 lonely organisms fighting for life. The enemy within had not been defeated. It had simply split their world into 2 warring camps. And while they were consumed by their internal war, they did not notice that their true, ultimate enemy, hunger, was preparing its final crushing blow. The schism that occurred that evening was final and irrevocable. The apartment turned into 2 warring camps. In one corner by the icy wall, Anna fashioned a sort of nest for Alyosha. She gave him almost all of her food, leaving only crumbs for herself to stay alive. She no longer spoke to her husband. She looked through him as if he were a piece of furniture, an inanimate object. In the other corner dwelled Dmitri Petrovich and Katya. The father continued his weighing ritual with fanatical obsession, but now he divided the daily ration into 3 parts. The 4th, intended for Anna, lay on the table, untouched by anyone. This was his silent war, his way of proving he was right. Katya was caught between 2 fires. She loved and pitied her mother and brother, but at the same time, she understood her father's icy logic. She watched Anna weaken before her eyes, and her young heart tore with pain and helplessness. One day, she couldn't bear it anymore. At night, while her father slept, she took her own tiny piece of bread, which she had hidden under her pillow, and crept over to her mother. She held out the bread to her. "Mama, eat," she whispered. "Please." Anna looked at her daughter with a long, unreadable gaze. Then she took the bread, but did not eat it. She soaked it and gave it to Alyosha. In that moment, Katya understood that for her mother, only one person was left in this world. It was the most terrifying lesson of her life. The main trial, however, was yet to come. The fuel for the Burzhvika was almost gone. They had burned everything they could. Furniture, books, even the wooden panels stripped from the walls. All that remained was the oak table where her father performed his rituals. This table was the last bastion of their former lives, the last artifact of civilization. But the cold was stronger than sentimentality. Dmitri Petrovich took the axe. Anna watched him chop the table, her face showing no emotion. The past had been burned, but the warmth did not last long. The frost intensified. The water in the bucket froze within an hour. They began to freeze. Alyosha stopped reacting to anything. He just lay there, his breathing growing quieter and shallower. Anna sat beside him, hugging him, trying to warm him with her own body. But her body, too, radiated almost no heat. And then, what was bound to happen, happened. The point of no return, beyond which the human ends and the beast begins. That night, Katya woke to a faint rustle. In the dim moonlight filtering through the ice on the window, she saw Alyosha slide off the bed and crawl toward the table. There, on the cloth, lay the morning's bread ration, which her father had prepared the evening before. His small, trembling hands reached for that life-saving morsel. He didn't want to steal. His body, his survival instinct, was leading him. He grabbed one of the pieces and frantically shoved it into his mouth. At that moment, Dmitri Petrovich woke up. He saw everything, but he didn't scream. He didn't lunge at his son. A terrible expression crossed his face, one of complete, absolute defeat. His system, his god, his religion of precision, it all came crashing down in an instant. He had built a fortress to protect them from chaos, but chaos had seeped inside, born from his own son. He stood up silently, walked over to Alyosha, who froze in terror, and just stared at him. There was no longer cruelty or justice in his eyes, only a bottomless black emptiness. The battle with the abyss was lost. They hadn't died of starvation, they hadn't frozen, they'd simply ceased to be human. And it was at that very moment, in the dead silence that followed, that they heard a sound. Distant, but distinct. A rumble. The rumble of heavy artillery. But it was different. It wasn't coming from the west, but from the east. And it didn't fade. It grew louder. The rumble of the cannonade grew for several days. It became the new background of their existence, even pushing aside the eternal hunger from their minds. At first, they didn't believe it. It seemed like an auditory hallucination, born of their tormented brains. But the rumbling didn't stop. It grew closer, clearer. Sometimes, the dry crackle of machine gun fire mixed with it. The war, which for so long had been a synonym for death and deprivation, now brought with it a ghostly hope. They stopped moving. They just sat in their icy cave and listened. They listened to the music of their salvation. On January 18th, 1943, the siege ring was broken. But for them, locked in their apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, the news arrived only several days later, in the form of the first real change. The bread had almost no additives. It was still dark and damp, but it was now real bread. Dmitry Petrovich waited on his scales. The ritual was performed, but it no longer held its former sanctity. It was just an action, carried out by inertia. The theft committed by Alyosha had broken something inside him. He had defeated his wife's rebellion, but had lost to the animal instinct of his own son. His faith in the system was shattered. Salvation came suddenly. One day they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, then a loud knock on the door. They didn't answer. They had long stopped expecting anyone. Then there was a crack, and the door, kicked in by a soldier's boot, collapsed inward. In the doorway, wreathed in clouds of frosty vapor, stood two soldiers in white camouflage. They were huge, rosy-cheeked, radiating life. Behind them was light. A bright, unbearable daylight they hadn't seen for many months. The soldiers froze for a moment, blinded by the gloom and stunned by what they saw. Before them were four shadows, four skeletons draped in gray skin, with enormous, crazed eyes. The room resembled a crypt, filled with stench and despair. One of the soldiers, a young man, couldn't take it, recoiled and muttered something. The second, older, with a weathered, stern face, stepped inside. "Anyone alive?" His voice echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence. No one answered. They just stared at the visitors from another world, unable to believe what was happening. The soldier took a loaf of bread and a lump of sugar from his bag. He held them out to Anna. She looked at the food but didn't take it. Her arms hung limply at her sides. Then the soldier approached Dmitry Petrovich. "Here, old man. Our boys broke through. Everything's going to be all right now." Dmitry Petrovich looked at the bread, then at his scales on the table. He slowly reached out his hand, but not for the bread. He touched the brass pan of the scales as if saying goodbye to the only thing that had held meaning in his world for the last 100 days. They were carried out on stretchers. The bright light seared their eyes. The fresh, frosty air burned their lungs. They were being taken to a hospital, and Katya, the only one with any strength left, looked at the ruins of her city. She saw other people, as emaciated as they were, saw trucks loaded with flour, saw tears on the faces of passers-by. They were saved. Physically, they were saved. But when her stretcher was placed next to her mother's, she tried to touch her hand. Anna pulled her hand away. In that moment, Katya understood that their real trials were just beginning. Surviving hell had turned out to be easier than returning from it. Evacuation. Hospital. White sheets, the smell of carbolic acid, and real, hot food. For hundreds of thousands of Leningraders, these words meant salvation, a return to life. For the Orlov family, they became the name of a new circle of hell. Their bodies, ravaged by prolonged starvation, struggled to accept nourishment. Their souls, mutilated by their ordeal, could not accept the new reality. They were placed in the same ward, in the hope that being with family would help them recover. But it was a mistake. They could not be together. The silence that had saved them in the frozen apartment became unbearable here, in the warmth and safety. It was filled with unspoken accusations, pain, and hatred. Dmitry Petrovich tried to speak to Anna, but she would turn away. He tried to take her hand, but she would snatch it back as if from a fire. To her, he would forever be the monster with the pharmacist's scales, the man who was willing to sacrifice her son for the sake of his insane idea. She could not and would not forgive him. Alyosha slowly recovered. His body began to heal, but his eyes remained empty. He barely spoke and was terrified of his father. Whenever Dmitry Petrovich entered the ward, the boy would shrink and hide under the blanket. Katya was the only link between them, but even her strength was not enough to piece together the shattered vessel of their family. She was torn between the father she pitied and the mother whose pain she felt too keenly. A month later, an investigator from the special department visited them. A man with tired, colorless eyes questioned Dmitry Petrovich at length about how they had managed to survive. Dmitry Petrovich, still a believer in logic and order, honestly told him everything about the carpenter's glue, the leather belt, and of course, about the scales and the strict system of distribution. The investigator listened in silence, his expression unchanging, and wrote something in his notebook. A week later, Dmitry Petrovich was summoned again. A conclusion was read to him. Under the conditions of the siege, he displayed cowardice, failing to provide adequate nutrition for his family, which led to their extreme emaciation. He wasn't put on trial. He wasn't shot. He was simply written off. His story, his tragedy, his monstrous experiment in survival turned out to be an inconvenient truth for the heroic chronicle of the defense of Leningrad. Heroes were needed here, not mad scientists weighing life on pharmacists' scales. It was the final blow. The system he had served his whole life, first science, then the state, had betrayed him. His feat, as he understood it, was deemed a crime. After the hospital, their paths diverged forever. Anna took the children and left for the evacuation to distant relatives in Siberia. In the letter she left for Dmitry, there were only 3 words: "Don't look for us." Dmitry Petrovich remained in Leningrad. He tried to return to work but couldn't. He wandered the streets of the rebuilding city like a ghost, a living reminder of what everyone wanted to forget as quickly as possible. It was said that he had lost his mind, that he would pick up breadcrumbs from the street and try to weigh them in the palm of his hand. He died 2 years after the war ended from a heart attack. A quiet, unremarkable man, buried in a mass grave. Katya grew up and became a doctor. She dedicated her life to saving people, as if trying to atone for her father's sins. She never told anyone about those 100 days in the frozen apartment. Alyosha suffered from health problems his entire life. He grew up to be a withdrawn, solitary man. The memory of hunger lived in his body, in his cells, until the very end. They were saved. They survived. But as a family, they died there, in that frozen apartment on Vasilyevsky Island. Their story became one of millions of nameless tragedies, where there were no heroes and no villains, only inhuman calculation and the terrible price paid for the right to live one more day. What became of those pharmacists' scales? Their fate is unknown. Perhaps they were thrown out with other junk when the apartment was cleared out after the Orlovs were gone. Perhaps they were sold for scrap metal. Or maybe they still lie somewhere in the attic of an old Leningrad building covered in the dust of oblivion. Official history, as is often the case, preserved only the dry figures. The number of dead, the tons of bombs dropped, the grams of siege bread. In this history, there was no room for the tragedy of a single family, for their small, terrible war in which the weapons were not rifles but pharmacists' scales. But stories like this do not disappear without a trace. They pass into folklore, transform into urban legends, whispered like a scary bedtime story. For a long time, an old tale circulated among the siege survivors about a strange pharmacist who went mad from hunger and tried to weigh the souls of his children on antique scales. It was said that his ghost still wanders Vasilyevsky Island, searching for the perfect balance between life and death. This legend, of course, is far from the truth. But like any legend, it carries a grain of truth within it. It is about how easily a civilized person reverts to a primal being in the face of true starvation. About how the most terrifying enemy is not the one shooting at you, but the one sitting inside you. And about how, sometimes, salvation is more terrifying than death itself. The story of the Orlov family is not a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about how, in the attempt to preserve life, one can lose everything that makes that life meaningful: love, compassion, humanity. Dmitry Petrovich was not a monster. He was a tragic figure, a man who tried to conquer chaos with order, but in the end became its slave and its victim. His system saved their bodies, but it burned their souls, leaving behind only a scorched wasteland. This story is not just another tale of the siege. It is a reminder that behind the dry facts and heroic reports, there are always millions of personal tragedies. And that the most important battle in any war is fought not on the front lines, but in the hearts of ordinary people, trapped in hell, and forced to make an inhuman choice. A choice after which to survive is not to win.